The explosion lasted seconds. The contamination lasted generations. And inside the radioactive scar later called the footprint of death, entire families remained behind, drinking poisoned water and raising children on land Moscow already knew was toxic. By the end, you'll know how a nuclear catastrophe erased villages without destroying their buildings, why Soviet officials watched the survivors instead of warning them, and what those families revealed about one of history's longest concealed disasters. To understand what happened, you have to travel into the southern Ural Mountains after the Second World War. The United States had the atomic bomb. Stalin wanted one immediately. So the Soviet Union built a secret nuclear complex called Mayak beside a new settlement now known as Ozersk. At the time, the city appeared under coded names such as Chelyabinsk 40. It was absent from ordinary maps. Mail was restricted. Roads were guarded. Tens of thousands of workers lived behind fences in a place the outside world was not supposed to see. Mayak's purpose was brutally simple: produce plutonium as quickly as possible. Safety came second. The reactors dumped radioactive waste into nearby waterways. Highly dangerous liquid waste was stored underground in steel tanks surrounded by concrete. One tank required a cooling system because the material inside continued producing heat. Then that cooling system failed. For months, the waste grew hotter. Salts dried into an unstable chemical mixture. Instruments were unreliable, maintenance was neglected, and the Soviet nuclear program kept moving at full speed. On September 29, 1957, the tank exploded. The blast hurled the tank's massive concrete cover into the air. Windows shattered across the complex. Workers saw a glowing column rise above the facility, filled with dust and radioactive particles. But there was no citywide alarm. No public emergency broadcast. Many employees simply finished their shifts. The explosion itself killed no one immediately. That made the disaster easier to disguise. There was no flattened metropolis, no burning reactor visible for miles. The real weapon was the cloud rising silently overhead. Winds carried radioactive material northeast across forests, farms, rivers, and villages. The fallout formed a long contaminated corridor later known as the East Urals Radioactive Trace. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers. People below watched strange dust settle on rooftops and fields. Some described an unusual glow in the sky. Children played outside. Farmers gathered crops. Families continued drawing water from wells and rivers because nobody told them the landscape had changed. Within hours, officials had measurements showing dangerously elevated radiation. The villagers had nothing. And here the story becomes more disturbing, because silence was not confusion. Silence became policy. Soldiers and technicians arrived carrying unfamiliar instruments. They examined soil, milk, crops, houses, and livestock. But they often refused to explain what they were measuring. Residents were told to slaughter animals, destroy food, or dig up fields. In some places, soldiers washed buildings and buried contaminated objects. People watched men in protective clothing move through their village, while they themselves wore ordinary coats and work boots. Evacuations began only after days had passed. And they did not happen all at once. Some communities were removed after a week. Others waited months. A number of settlements remained occupied far longer, even though officials understood the danger. Altogether, thousands were eventually displaced, and contaminated villages were demolished or removed from maps. Families were ordered onto trucks with limited belongings. They were warned not to discuss where they had lived. Their homes, tools, clothes, and animals were left behind. But the evacuation line had an edge. On one side, a village might be emptied. On the other, families stayed. The boundary was not a wall that stopped radiation. It was an administrative decision drawn across a contaminated landscape. Imagine living there. You are told nothing has happened, yet soldiers remove your neighbors. Doctors begin asking unusual questions. Officials record what you eat, where you work, and how often you become sick. Your children develop persistent illnesses. Livestock weaken. Forest signs warn against gathering berries or mushrooms, but the explanation is vague. You still need fuel. You still need food. You still need water. Contamination does not look contaminated. A radioactive field still grows wheat. A radioactive river still reflects sunlight. A radioactive house still feels like home. Some residents ignored restrictions because the rules seemed arbitrary. Others understood the risk but had nowhere else to go. Leaving without state permission could mean abandoning employment, housing, ration access, and family networks. And the disaster did not exist publicly, so survivors could not openly demand help for something the government denied had occurred. Their medical histories were absorbed into classified institutions. Diagnoses were sometimes described in obscure terms rather than plainly linked to radiation. These families were not merely trapped by fallout. They were trapped by secrecy. But before we reach what Moscow was really doing with them, you need to understand something even stranger. The 1957 explosion was not the beginning. Years before the tank ruptured, Mayak had released radioactive waste into the Teka River system. Villages downstream depended on that water for drinking, washing, fishing, and livestock. Residents were exposed day after day, often without knowing why doctors kept examining them. Some riverside communities were evacuated. Others remained. Barriers appeared near the water, but daily life made perfect separation impossible. Children crossed them. Cattle drank from the river. Families used contaminated floodplains because survival demanded it. Then came the explosion and its airborne plume. Later, wind lifted radioactive sediment from a shrinking lake used for waste, spreading contamination again. This was not one isolated accident. It was a chain of exposures layered across the same region, while the state divided residents into categories, measured their bodies, and restricted what could be said. Now the question changes. Why leave anyone there at all? Soviet medical institutions assembled long-term records on exposed populations, where people lived, estimated radiation doses, illnesses, pregnancies, blood changes, and causes of death. That research produced valuable knowledge about chronic radiation exposure. But for the residents, the arrangement was chilling. You could be examined without being fully informed. You could be monitored without being given the facts needed to protect yourself. Your village could become useful precisely because people continued living under contaminated conditions. This does not mean every family was deliberately kept in place as part of one neatly designed experiment. Bureaucracy, housing shortages, economic pressure, military secrecy, and disagreement over acceptable exposure all shaped the decisions. The reality is more unsettling than a single order. An entire system treated public ignorance as manageable. Officials could study consequences, control movement, classify records, and avoid the political cost of admitting that the race for the bomb had poisoned Soviet citizens. The survivors became evidence locked inside the same state responsible for their exposure. And outside the restricted zone, almost nobody knew their names. The catastrophe became known as the Kyshtym disaster because Kyshtym was a nearby town visible on maps. The actual nuclear city was secret. That detail tells you how the concealment worked. The Soviet state did not need to erase every witness. It controlled maps, hospitals, newspapers, scientific publications, travel, and official language. Survivors could tell relatives that soldiers had arrived or villages had vanished, but they could not prove the scale. In the West, fragments emerged gradually. Émigré scientist Jares Medvedev publicized evidence of a major Soviet nuclear accident in the 1970s. Many doubted him. The idea sounded too enormous to remain concealed. Yet scattered scientific studies had described ecological radiation effects in the Urals without clearly identifying the cause. The evidence was present, stripped of its story. Only as secrecy weakened near the end of the Soviet era did the broader outline become undeniable. Here is the full reveal. Kyshtym was one of the most serious nuclear accidents in history, later rated level 6 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, one step below Chernobyl and Fukushima. A waste tank exploded. A radioactive plume crossed a vast inhabited region. Hundreds of settlements lay within the broader contaminated territory. Thousands of people were evacuated, many only after significant exposure. Others continued living near poisoned land and waterways for years. But Moscow hid more than an explosion. It hid the human geography of the disaster. The empty villages were erased. The remaining villages were normalized. Medical observations were classified. Contaminated residents became statistics inside institutions they could not challenge. And that is why tracing the families who stayed matters. Their story shows that a nuclear catastrophe does not require a mushroom cloud or a ruined reactor. It can happen quietly, through contaminated milk, river water, garden soil, bureaucratic delays, and a doctor who knows more than the patient is allowed to hear. The footprint of death was not only radioactive land. It was a zone where knowledge itself had been rationed. Decades later, communities in the region continued arguing over exposure, relocation, compensation, and health. Radiation risk is difficult to trace through one individual body. Cancer and chronic illness have many causes. Records can be incomplete. Dose estimates can change. That uncertainty gives authorities room to dispute responsibility. But uncertainty is not innocence. The sequence is documented: reckless waste handling, known contamination, delayed evacuations, restricted information, and long-term observation of exposed communities. You are left with a landscape where ordinary objects became historical witnesses. A well. A milk pail. A demolished foundation beneath weeds. A family photograph from a village that disappeared from official maps. The catastrophe survived because people remembered what the documents tried to reduce to measurements. They remembered which trucks came, which houses were burned, which relatives became ill, and which questions doctors refused to answer. Kyshtym forces you to confront a terrifying truth: when a government controls both the danger and the evidence, survival may depend on information you are never allowed to receive. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next, we uncover another operation conducted over an unsuspecting population. Operation Sea Spray, the Navy bacteria test over San Francisco. Because sometimes the people inside the experiment are the last ones told it ever happened.